Hello and welcome to the FuseBox in sunny Brighton. Today we're in conversation with Professor Anne Light, who is a Professor of Design and Technology at the University of Sussex. This is part of the ESRC's Festival of Social Science, and we'd like to thank the ESRC for making this event possible, for the University of Sussex, and for our own organisation, WiredSussex, who together have put this talk on. The talk is really interesting. It's on design, technology and social justice, concepts which aren't necessarily talked about in the same breath. And I'm really looking forward to talking with Anne today. So Anne, the title of this talk is Design, Technology and Social Justice. Can you maybe start by giving us your idea of the relationship between design and design practices and social justice?
If we start with design as a way that we constitute our world, we are making our world as we design things, then social justice is one of those fundamentals that can be easily written out, but if we want to take people with us, then it's a starting point, because otherwise we are in a position where people are being discriminated against through our arbitrary designing. So it's kind of a core. And one of the things about particularly digital technologies, as we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, is that they create new kinds of divide. And so we need to be mindful of those and really compensate, because if just left to things like market forces, they really drive wedges between people and create new areas of precarity and poverty. And we really see that.
So what's the role then of design professionals and the role of communities in design practice and socially positive design?
We're at the moment running a project which is called Not Equal in the Vernacular. It's looking at social justice in the digital economy. And one of the things that we've absolutely insisted upon, we've got some money to fund projects, is that they work closely with community partners, and they really are community partners in this instance, not just people who aren't academics. But we've got researchers working with sort of charities, different types of small organisation that are on the kind of chalk face of managing people's vulnerabilities and making sure that they're not vulnerable. And that's been really quite transformative for some of the researchers. They've had to come in with a relationship, but that relationship has really deepened during the process of doing the work. A lot of the researchers might have identified themselves as technologists rather than designers. And so when you're thinking about what designers bring, quite often it's that translation process. It's being able to empathise and research and connect with what's going on in people's lives, rather than just assume that we know enough and then bridge those gaps.
Because here we are in Brighton, a very strong design community, and also, traditionally and historically, a strong relationship with making sure that it's an open and social city.
Yes.
I just kind of wonder, for those designers who are used to models like the double diamond and things like that, what do they need to do, or what should they be thinking about in terms of the way that they do things that they may be not doing now? What does your research tell you about?
Well, I hope they are doing some of it. I mean, Brighton's really interesting because it's such an open and generous place, and also a place of great inequality. So in a sense, we've got a really good test bed for making it work within our own area. And what people can be doing, I think, it's manifested in different ways as universal design, inclusive design, but that can be quite trivializing because it just means that you're trying to do something for everybody. With social justice, I think you have to be much more proactive and say, okay, this is likely to have consequences that we haven't even predicted yet. That much we'll know because things tend to have these consequences, and we're increasingly see it now looking at the way that We're noticing the manipulation of social media, for instance, and it's not a surprise to some people, but it seems to be a surprise to a lot of people. And so anticipating that there will be people who lose or unintended consequences is kind of a way of dealing with uncertainty by saying we know there will be uncertainty. We just don't quite know where it's going to appear and who's going to be made, whose jobs might go, why it is that people in a point system can't use universal credit to their best advantage and things like that. And being mindful of that comes in right at the beginning when you're scoping something. It's too late when you're just discussing an interface. I mean, clearly it's important that it's in different languages and that it's usable by people, but that is just such an add-on by then. And when we're thinking about how we're constructing society, it has to be right up front. Otherwise you end up with systems that, whether deliberately or inadvertently, are prejudicial to people. And I mean, predictive policing is the big classic at the moment, where it's obvious that if you look at postcodes or something like that, you're judging people before they've grown up, before they've done anything. And then you're kind of reproducing it by putting your police efforts into that space. So that's a really well-known instance of a failure of social justice. But increasingly, I think we have to also link it to, why we're designing a tool and what we're designing. And so a lot of my work is tending more towards looking at social and environmental justice, so that we're actually thinking about why it is that certain parts of the world or the community get all the kind of bad effects of the environment, as well as some, the sort of the more classic things that social justice deals with, such as being excluded from decision making or lacking basic amenities.
So why do you think it is then that so much technology is poorly designed in terms of its social impact? Is it intrinsic to the technology itself? Is it intrinsic to the ownership of that technology? Is it the designer's challenges?
I think it's cultural. I don't think you can lay things exclusively at the tools that you're using. I think there is a kind of sometimes an indifference to how things are designed and who suffers, because there's something fun about making things, and there isn't always something that fun about being told, but have you thought about the starving millions? Yeah. But part of it is also just that we have if you're operating in a system where everything is about making the most money or turning people into commodities or moving them around, then you're not giving basic dignity. You're not interested in whether people have ideas. It's very much about, profit motive or something like that. And social justice sits in real tension with those kinds of values. And so for designers to earn a living in a culture where that's dominant, it's difficult for them to break out of it. There's usually somebody who has predicted. I was just thinking about this sort of divisiveness of social media and thinking that in the late 90s, we were looking at this daily newspaper called the Daily Me that Nicholas Negroponte had proposed. And at the time, people were saying, well, if people only read the news they're interested in, what is going to happen to society? Well, that was 20 years ago, and now that's exactly what's happening. So it's not that people didn't know there was a risk, it's that people weren't acting on it because there wasn't it wasn't a groundswell of enthusiasm to tackle those kinds of issues before they arose.
So in your research and your activity at the university, give me some examples, or an example even, of what you see as good design practice which is targeted towards social justice, and why?
What we're seeing is, as I think I mentioned already, that if you go hand in hand with a social organisation that is actually expressing a different set of values from perhaps the ones that are dominant in society, then you're in a position where you can see a different set of values and work within them. And the partnership there is really important. It's not enough just to kind of hear what the problem is from somebody, but it's about going in together and really trying to understand why the issues are the way they are, and because otherwise you end up with a technical solution to something that may well be a much more complex problem. So, for instance, if you're looking at care and its needs, it may be that it's not a new app that somebody needs. It may be they actually just need the time to be able to find out what would be useful to them. And that's a really different kind of problem to solve. But there might be technology or a clever design that can help with that kind of thing, but it isn't just providing them with an app. So to give a specific example, we've got all kinds of things. I mean, the projects we've been doing at the moment, some of them are looking at how you equip people who perhaps on the breadline with access to food that wouldn't otherwise have found its way back into circulation. So it benefits the circular economy as well as people who are struggling to make ends meet, particularly at the moment. But at the other end, we've got people doing live action role play to try and anticipate how artificial intelligence could be used to make sure that there is enough food for everybody in cities, in the face of climate change, and make sure that it's equitably distributed before it happens, so that instead of trying to compensate later for a system that's not working well, actually thinking, well, let's get algorithms into use that have different kind of metrics in them which consider different kinds of angle.
So is that an attempt then to ensure that, at the very least, you understand any biases that you're using when you construct the algorithm, or is it an attempt to get rid of those biases altogether?
Well, I think we probably both know that you cannot eliminate certain kinds of tendency, particularly in systems based on numerical values. They don't come out and hug you. But not yet. But within that, it's about trying to, I think the whole thing here is about being more mindful and saying that you end up with unexpected consequences. But if you can work with the idea of that and start to say, what is this algorithm likely to enable? What is the training data likely to produce? You're already going to be in a different position. So some of the research we've been doing with Not Equal is just to look at how well people understand those kinds of prejudices and the way that they get built into systems, both in the community and on the designer side. And the idea of kind of designing with data, I think, is becoming super important now, because that's when you start to understand what the repercussions of those decisions are.
Is there an attempt then to, you talk about the fact that there is going to be unintended consequences and uncertainty in things that happen, but are you trying to reduce that? In other words, are you trying to develop a better design process which reduces the amount of uncertainty, or is it just an acceptance that you can never do that life is too complex, that people and society is too complex to do that?
Well, maybe it introduces uncertainty into a different space. So if you're doing something that's deliberately tries to be fair, you may fail. But it's a really different proposition from delivering something like, I have a strand of work that looks after the gig economy. And there it's really obvious that the pressures on people working in that space are to design away from fairness, to maximise gamification, to hook drivers in. Drivers start to reciprocate by gaming the system by using multiple apps, and then they're all playing off each other. And that's a kind of race to the bottom in terms of fairness. And ultimately, it's predicted that this is about writing people out of the equation completely and replacing them with cars, or understanding enough about a creative process so that it can be replaced by artificial intelligence. All of this handing power more and more to the machines and more to individuals or kind of small groups, as a company, but not providing for a much, a kind of enabled workforce. In that kind of context, it's really clear that that's what's going on. So it's not uncertain. But if you design for fairness, what might be uncertain is how much profit you make, how you can compete in those environments. And so the uncertainty might be the viability of the company. Now that sounds really terrible to our our society's ears, because you have to be able to compete. But if there were a change of culture where there was some regulation that meant that this kind of thing was important, then we would start to see real social justice introduced into areas like that. So one of the things we notice, and I've got colleagues who are looking much more generally at kind of alleviating poverty, ending domestic violence, and things that are not going away, but they can at least be tackled with a complete will across society. Whereas when you're right up at the profit kind of motive, you find that actually the will to do social justice is quite low because it's not competitive. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of we can't design it out, but we can wittingly design for a different way of being. And if we are going to deal with some of the more epic challenges we're facing, I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're looking at climate crisis, all kinds of other destabilizations that fall out from climate crisis. If those are the things that are kind of inflecting the future, then things like social justice and taking everybody with us is going to be really important in a new way. We've already seen an increase in regulation of how we live because of the pandemic. So it's not unrealistic to say that we could make social justice and environmental justice a greater focus. It's just not what we're doing.
And what's your take then? You mentioned the pandemic, and we can't avoid the fact that, as you say, we're discussing this right in the middle of some incredibly challenging times, shall we say. What's your take on that then, and the role of design and technology in that whole kind of process, and not just in terms of the way that technologies, there's an attempt to produce technologies to counter the pandemic, but also the way that there's an attempt to design changes in societal behaviour. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a fascinating area that we're only just starting to see sort of emerge. I mean, one of the things in the context of social justice that I have to observe is that as soon as everything goes online the way it has, I was talking to people on Sarawak the other day, and I couldn't have done that because they can use Zoom, and they were in a place where they could get access to it. Not their own village, but they'd gone somewhere to talk to us. But there's lots of people in our own country who are not able. There was, a fantastic initiative which was swapping resources so that people had the things they needed in the community up in Glasgow. And looking at their swap shop, it's been immobilised by this because they can't work with half the people that they were working with because they don't have even the basic digital technology to participate. So there's something about how people get access to things when modes of engagement suddenly change dramatically like this. Then what we can do to design around this, I mean, I've got students at the moment who are looking at antimicrobial resistance and thinking about what shape we might move in our world if we have to keep our distance in the way that we are now. And rather than going back to old processes of just kind of, what should we say, bustling around, everybody actually, has to walk down one side of the street and walk up the other and things like that to keep a space. And those things which sound like science fiction, but we're now living.
Yeah. And it's a shame, it seems a shame to me. I can understand the logic of those kind of things, but it seems a shame, one of the great things about cities is their chaos and anarchism almost, out of all that kind of humanity. I mean, humanity comes really interesting, creative and cultural outputs. Can we over-design, I guess, is the question,
We can certainly over-button down. I mean, I'm not sitting here to say, we shouldn't be looking after ourselves. I think it's really important that we do, and it's a priority. But we can lose joy in the process of trying to find, equality on the one hand can be too levelling in the sense that it can just take away, all variety. But I think that's less of a concern at the moment. But I think controlling things to the point where everything gets dull, and some of the initiatives that we're seeing in kind of the more technological design space, where it's very much about, oh, well, we can do everything remotely, but actually, as you say, we miss too much. So then it's a question of what does it mean to all sit in a park in the middle of winter and chat in a group of 6, those kinds of things, and providing opportunities to rethink those kinds of engagement so that they're fun and they're safe, and people starting to build little, what would you call it, like mangers almost, so that they can sit out with their friends, and it's outside, but it's sheltered because of the British weather.
Yeah, the good old British weather. So you've got a new book that I believe you're currently writing,
Yes.
called Designs to Reshape Humanity. Can you tell me a bit about the genesis for that? Why you wanted to write a book on that subject, and what you think it might include at this point in time?
It came out of a talk I gave about existential crisis, designing for existential crisis, and how we got ourselves out of what was looking to be quite a tricky year. It was 2017. Of course, it looks like an even more tricky year now. But at the time...
No year will beat 2020 in the tricky states.
Oh, I don't know. Who knows where we're going next?
Famous last
Please
words.
don't say things like that. But at the time, we were looking at sort of rises in immigration. We were looking at desert. I'm not going to be able to say that word. Like the lack of rain in some parts of the world, and famine, and lots of really challenging conditions, and there was a lot of concern in the design community that people didn't know what to do, and I think that goes on. So it came out of that, and then there was a real. I was kind of almost pushed to the pen and told, okay, discuss this. What do you actually see as being an alternative? And existential crisis is really predicated on a failure of meaning, and not just necessarily in individuals. It can be a whole culture's failure of meaning. And I think we're in the midst of that at the moment.
Can you just expand what you mean by a failure of meaning? Well,
there have been times in history when people had a real strong sense of why they were alive and what they were doing, and how the future was going to pan out. And it wasn't necessarily very desirable, because it inspired people to go and invade other countries and colonise and grab resources. But there was a sense of progress. But it's not a very suitable model. We now need to manage resources differently. We might be downscaling some of the things we valued. And in those contexts, it's really difficult to know, well, what gets offered instead? Because you don't just want a sense of diminishment and oblivion. You want dignity, and you want a sense that you've got something to contribute, and that your life, however small, is worth it, and those of the people around you. And if that's getting eroded, and we see the problems, if you're unemployed, that can be a factor. We've got the kind of indignation of white privilege, of people who don't understand that they have certain things on their side because they don't have others. And those kinds of things are really and particularly in the context of what's happening to the environment, the overuse of plastics, the things that are going to be making us ill and vulnerable in the future. The idea of designing to reshape humanity came out of that, because the idea so much of the time with design is that we are controlling our environment and stabilizing things and managing other people. And so everything has been very much about, and has been for 12,000 years. It's not just in the last few years as we've created digital technology so that we can do it at the press of a button. We've had this long history of control and more control. And now we're in a situation where we can't control our way out of the situation. So what do we do instead? We find different sources of meaning and value. And so it's very idealistic, but it looks at how things like creative practices, in which design's heavily implicated, arts, other kinds of citizen science, the kinds of things that you can do that allow you to think round things instead of just carrying on in the usual way, and where we might find new kinds of gainful employment for people. And so my somewhat cheeky vision is that we end up, instead of with governance as we have at the moment, which is very much about control, we end up with a kind of wisdom that comes both from the top and the bottom, but a lot more kind of creative practice, maybe a creative practitioner on every corner, to help people find something that's important, even as things are changing, and to help navigate a period when we're going to see much more rapid change than we've been seeing. Or if we don't, we're actually not going to see very much at all.
Wow. Sounds really interesting, and I do hope you come back when you've published the book.
When it's written, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Just to round up and finish off, I'm just kind of just interested in what your take on the current state of design is, you know, I'm interested in where you think it's going to go in the future, or where you would like to see design go in the future.
Well,
because often for people, I guess, just to give you a couple of more seconds thinking time on that, often people see design as merely about making the product look good or feel nice. And you're talking about a model of design which is much broader and potentially more impactful than that.
Yes, I think it's re-engineering everything we live by, but doing it very creatively, because if it was just re-engineering, we'd be doing it by now. So it's having to rethink the relationship between values and cultures and what we produce, and deal with a lot of infrastructural legacy. So it's not it's anything but trivial. But where I'd like to see design going, I think there's a lot of work being done now to make design human-centred. And ironically, for a lot of people in design who've been saying this for years, artificial intelligence is now to be made human-centred and so on. But really, we've kind of done that, and it isn't serving us very well. I mean, it's better than business-centred, but it doesn't, I mean, unless you're a business, but it can't just be business-centred for people. But the human-centred idea ignores the fact of these interrelationships that are crucial. I mean, we're starting to understand that because of the threat to bees, but really we just underestimate things like plants. I mean, if we let plants go, we die. I mean, it's simple. So then one of the things that we need to be thinking about in design terms is not then how do we do human-centred design? It is how do we do planet-centric design? We start talking about the planet, everything changes. And then we have to start asking the people we're doing the design for, because usually we're being employed by somebody or an agency who's working to someone else's brief. It's like where they want to be and which side of history, because that choice is coming up fast. And if you ignore the planet, you're on the wrong side of history, by it just de facto.
Yeah. Anne Light from the University of Sussex, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil.